October 4th, 1957, 11:18 p.m., Lenox Avenue, Harlem. A back entrance off 125th Street that drivers used when they didn't want to be seen arriving. Albert Anastasia came in without ceremony. No announcement. No crowd parting for him. Just two men ahead of him checking the corners, and one man behind him closing the door like it was already decided nobody would be running through it. Inside, the lounge was still working the way Harlem always worked. Music low enough to talk business over, glasses moving, cash moving faster, men watching each other without turning their heads. The room didn't stop when Anastasia entered. It tightened, because everyone in there understood the difference between a visitor and an inspection. This wasn't his neighborhood. Not his color, not his language, not his politics. Harlem did not belong to Italian bosses on paper, and it did not belong to them in pride. But power didn't ask permission, and Anastasia had built an entire reputation on showing up where he wasn't invited and leaving with what he wanted. A table along the wall had been kept open the way a seat is kept open at a funeral. No place card, no name, just space. The kind of space that makes men nervous because it implies someone important is expected, and someone else is expected to pay for it. Anastasia crossed the room and sat without looking for approval. Across from him, Harlem's people didn't rush to greet him. They didn't smile, they didn't stand. They measured the insult the way accountants measure a missing dollar, quietly, precisely. Then one man moved from the shadows near the doorway, older now, heavier in the face, but still built like a decision that couldn't be reversed. Bumpy Johnson didn't hurry. He didn't perform. He just walked toward the table like the distance between them was territory being tested one step at a time, and when Bumpy stopped, close enough for Anastasia to see the steadiness in his eyes, the room understood the situation for what it was. Not a meeting, not a negotiation, but a moment where loyalty was going to be priced in public and paid for in private. The wall table and the error that wasn't an accident. In 1957, Harlem was fast money and slow pride. The kind of place where the wrong gesture could cost you a block, but the right one could buy you a decade of quiet. Anastasia wasn't from Harlem, and that was exactly why his presence there felt like a provocation. He wasn't looking for acceptance, he was testing resistance. Albert Anastasia understood rooms the way other men understood streets. He didn't need maps. He needed angles. A wall table gave him the door without forcing him to face it. It gave him the bar without turning his back. It gave him the stairwell in his periphery, where men disappeared when they wanted to make a call and reappeared when they had decided what kind of night it would be. Harlem noticed the choice immediately. In a neighborhood built on controlled appearances, where authority was enforced through ritual as much as violence, a seat was never just a seat. It was a claim. Outsiders could visit, even do business, as long as they looked temporary. Anastasia did not look temporary. He sat like a man who had already decided the room would adjust around him. The first adjustment was small. Service slowed. Not enough to cause a scene, just enough to signal that hospitality was conditional. A waiter passed him once without making eye contact. A glass that should have been refilled wasn't. The music stayed steady, but the laughter at nearby tables turned careful, like men laughing to prove they weren't tense. Anastasia didn't react. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't complain. That restraint was misread by the wrong people. In Harlem, loud men were easy to handle. Quiet men were harder. Quiet men forced you to guess. Guessing is where mistakes begin. The second adjustment came from the corners. Harlem operators, men who ran numbers through barbershops and grocery stores, began to reposition without appearing to move. A man leaned against the wall, closer to the hallway. Another shifted to a seat with a clearer view of the door. Not to protect Anastasia, to contain him. The message was simple. You can sit here, but you are being watched. Anastasia let them watch. He ordered coffee and didn't touch it. He took a cigarette out slowly, held it between two fingers, and waited. No rush, no impatience. A man who is nervous checks his watch. A man who is confident lets time do the work. Upstairs, the Lennox room filled with men who believed they were managing a problem. They spoke about territory the way accountants speak about debt. They didn't call Anastasia a boss. They called him a pressure, someone whose presence would invite more Italians, more collectors, more demands disguised as partnership. The room agreed on one thing. If Harlem did nothing, Harlem would look weak. That was the error that wasn't an accident. They assumed the danger was Anastasia's ambition. They assumed he came uptown to take something. They didn't consider the other possibility, that he came to measure who would resist first and how. The wall table forced the room to reveal itself. Who avoided him, who stared too long, who made the quiet trip to the back hallway to send word upstairs. Anastasia didn't need introductions. He watched behavior and let it speak. By the time Harlem finished deciding what to do with him, Anastasia had already learned what he came to learn. Not who controlled the room, but who was nervous enough to try proving it. Big Sam, loyalty as a job, survival as a debt. Big Sam wasn't born a traitor. He became one when he learned loyalty doesn't pay hospital bills, doesn't stop evictions, doesn't protect a daughter when someone decides to squeeze. In the underworld, men don't break from ambition as often as they break from pressure. And when they break, the city uses them. Sam had been useful for a long time. Not powerful, useful. The kind of man who knew who to call, which doors stayed unlocked after midnight, which runners skimmed and which ones were clean. He didn't run Harlem, but Harlem ran through him. Information, collections, introductions, loyalty, as long as loyalty stayed affordable. The pressure started quietly. It always does. A landlord who suddenly wanted cash instead of patience. A doctor who stopped taking promises. A man from downtown who asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. Sam told himself he was managing it, that he could balance both sides without choosing one. That was the lie that kept him moving. Albert Anastasia didn't recruit men like Sam with threats. He didn't need to. He let the city do the work first. By the time Sam was approached, the numbers already didn't add up. Anastasia's people didn't promise safety. They promised relief. A payment that arrived on time. A problem that stopped escalating. No speeches, no contracts. Just money that appeared when Sam needed it most. That was how the debt formed. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Each favor small enough to justify. Each silence easier than the last. Sam didn't think of it as betrayal. He thought of it as survival with conditions. Harlem had rules, but those rules depended on men being able to afford them. When survival becomes expensive, principles become negotiable. Sam didn't set out to sell anyone out. He just stopped correcting assumptions. He let meetings happen without him. Let routes overlap. Let introductions be delayed long enough for someone else to step in. By the time Sam realized he was being used, it was too late to step back. He was already inside the plan, not as a decision-maker, but as a hinge. A man whose cooperation didn't need to be loud to be decisive. Anastasia understood that kind of man better than most. Men like Sam don't need ideology. They need an exit that doesn't look like a failure. What Sam didn't understand was the difference between being paid and being protected. Anastasia paid him. He never protected him. Protection is earned by men who can't be replaced. Sam was replaceable. His value was in his access, and access expires the moment it's exposed. When the night came, when the room closed and the wall table mattered, Sam believed he was still balancing both sides. He believed he had time. That belief was the final debt coming due. Loyalty had been his job. Survival had become his excuse. And in Harlem, excuses don't stop consequences. $50,000 and the men who get paid without getting dirty. The money didn't come out of a pocket. It came off a table. From a conversation where nobody raised their voice and nobody wrote anything down. In New York, real orders didn't come with signatures. They came through intermediaries who smiled like salesmen and made promises that looked like rescue until they became a chain. $50,000 was not a random number in 1957. It was specific. Enough to solve a problem without attracting attention. Too small to look like a takeover. Too large to be charity. It was the kind of figure that told everyone involved this wasn't about profit. It was about positioning. The men who handled it never touched Harlem directly. They didn't walk Lenox. They didn't sit in the lounges. They stayed in offices downtown and back rooms behind legitimate fronts where Italian suits and clean hands created distance. Their job wasn't to threaten. It was to normalize the idea that something was already decided. The pitch was simple. There was instability uptown. Too many egos. Too much noise. Anastasia's name was mentioned casually, not as a threat, but as a solution. He wasn't coming to take over. He was coming to stabilize, to make sure collections stayed predictable, to make sure nobody panicked and did something that invited attention from people who didn't ask questions first. $50,000 didn't buy loyalty. It bought cooperation without fingerprints. It moved through Big Sam and men like him because they were positioned where money could change direction without changing ownership. They didn't pull triggers. They redirected flow. A delayed payment here, a missed warning there, small misalignments that only mattered when added together. What made the money effective was its timing. It arrived when pressure was already building, when Harlem operators were arguing about margins and protection, when pride was expensive and patience was wearing thin. The money didn't create betrayal. It accelerated it. No one who touched that 50,000 believed they were ordering violence. They believed they were managing risk, creating leverage, giving Anastasia a cleaner entrance than force would allow. If something happened, it would be blamed on local tensions, personal disputes, Harlem problems staying in Harlem. That illusion mattered. It allowed men to sleep at night, to tell themselves they weren't responsible for outcomes they had quietly enabled. In New York, distance is how guilt stays solvent. Anastasia understood this system intimately. He didn't need to be present to influence it. He let the intermediaries do what they did best: talk, smooth, reassure. By the time he walked into Harlem himself, the money had already done its work. The room was primed, loyalties were stretched, decisions were halfway made. $50,000 didn't buy control. It bought uncertainty, and uncertainty is where men make the mistakes that decide everything. Why Anastasia walked into Harlem when he didn't have two? Albert Anastasia had power elsewhere. He had men. He had reputation. He had the kind of name that made problems change direction. But Harlem wasn't just another corner on a map. It was a symbol. And stepping into it meant accepting one rule: if you cross that line, someone will try to charge you for it. Anastasia didn't need Harlem's money. His interest ran through docks, unions, contracts that never appeared on paper. He could have stayed downtown and let intermediaries handle whatever pressure was building uptown. That would have been safer, cleaner. But safety was never the point. Influence was. Harlem represented something Anastasia couldn't secure from a distance. Autonomy, not ownership, not tribute, but recognition. Harlem had resisted outsiders longer than most neighborhoods in New York. Italians, Jews, Irish, they had all tried to lean on it. Most were pushed back or forced into uneasy arrangements. That resistance created pride, and pride, when left unchecked, turns into precedent. Anastasia understood precedent better than territory. If Harlem could decide who was allowed to enter and who wasn't, then the limits of his reputation were being tested publicly. Silence would have been interpreted as avoidance. Avoidance would have been interpreted as weakness, and weakness, once assigned, is expensive to correct. Walking in himself collapsed that ambiguity. It forced Harlem to respond to the man, not the rumor, to measure him directly rather than speculate through second-hand accounts. Anastasia didn't announce demands. He didn't arrive with an entourage meant to intimidate. He arrived as if entry had already been approved. That posture mattered. Power that asks permission invites negotiation. Power that assumes access forces a decision. Harlem now had to choose how it would react, not whether Anastasia belonged there. There was also a practical calculation. Anastasia trusted information more than loyalty. By entering Harlem personally, he could see who stiffened, who leaned in, who sent word upstairs too quickly. Distance filters behavior. Proximity exposes it. Men perform differently when the consequence is sitting across from them. He also understood the value of risk. A boss who never appears in hostile territory becomes abstract. Abstract power fades. Real power leaves footprints. Anastasia's presence created stakes for everyone involved. If something happened to him, consequences would not stay local. Harlem knew that. So did the men who thought they could manage him through proxies. Walking into Harlem wasn't necessary. That was precisely why it worked. It signaled confidence without explanation. It suggested that whatever resistance existed had already been accounted for. And when a man behaves as if the outcome is settled, others begin to act as if it might be. That was the real reason Anastasia came uptown. Not to take Harlem, but to find out who believed he could be stopped. The Lennox Room. Where respect gets measured without witnesses, the private room wasn't built for comfort. It was built for leverage. The door closed clean, the walls held sound, and the only window faced an alley where nobody asked questions. Harlem meetings weren't ceremonies. They were audits. Who had earned? Who had stolen? Who had started believing the street belonged to them? The Lenox Room existed because public space lies. Too many eyes, too many versions of the same story. Upstairs, away from the music and the noise, things narrowed. Men didn't posture as much. They sat where they were told or where they could justify sitting. The room did the sorting before anyone spoke. Anastasia understood immediately what kind of room it was. He didn't comment on it, didn't scan it theatrically. He let the door close behind him and stood just long enough to register who was already there. Harlem's real authority wasn't always the loudest man. It was the one who didn't need to arrive early. Bumpy Johnson was already seated, not at the head, not at the edge, centered, balanced, close enough to everyone to hear, far enough to avoid being crowded. That placement hadn't been accidental. In Harlem, seating was a statement of responsibility. Whoever sat there owned the outcome, not just the decision. Around them were men who thought they understood what the meeting was about. Collections, boundaries, a visitor who needed to be reminded where he was. That assumption shaped their posture. A few leaned back, arms crossed. A few leaned forward, elbows on the table, ready to argue margins. None of them had prepared for what the room was actually meant to measure. Anastasia didn't sit right away. He waited for the room to settle. That pause created discomfort. Men adjusted in their chairs. Someone cleared his throat and stopped. Silence like that doesn't ask to be filled. It demands to be respected. When Anastasia finally took his seat, it wasn't dominant. It was deliberate. He placed himself where he could see Bumpy without staring him down, where everyone else was in his peripheral vision. He didn't take control of the room. He let the room reveal who thought they had it. The first words spoken were cautious, framed as clarification. Who had authorized the meeting? What exactly was being discussed? Safe questions meant to establish ground without committing to a position. Anastasia answered them briefly, without expanding. Every answer removed another excuse to misunderstand. This wasn't negotiation yet. It was alignment. Men discovering whether they were sitting in the right place for the night they were about to have. In rooms like this, violence wasn't decided by emotion. It was decided by math. Risk versus consequence. Who would absorb the shock if things went wrong? The Lenox Room had one rule everyone understood. Whatever happened here would not be disputed downstairs. No witnesses meant no appeals. Decisions made in that space carried weight because they couldn't be softened later. By the time the door closed fully and the hallway went quiet, the audit had already begun. Not of territory, of men. The gun that doesn't fire and the strategy that humiliates without blood. A useless gun isn't always a malfunction. Sometimes it's a trap built to make a traitor expose himself without forcing you to hunt him. Anastasia didn't need a shootout inside a Harlem lounge. He needed witnesses. He needed betrayal to have a shape, a face, and public shame before any private punishment. Anastasia had learned early that violence, when used too quickly, erases information. A dead man takes motives with him. Fear silences rooms that might otherwise talk. What he wanted in the Lenox Room wasn't chaos. It was clarity. He wanted to see who believed the moment had arrived and who understood it hadn't. The gun had been introduced quietly, not waved, not threatened with, just placed where it could be reached if someone decided they were brave or desperate. That distinction mattered. Brave men act when they believe they are supported. Desperate men act when they believe time is run out. Anastasia was watching for both. When Big Sam made his move, it wasn't dramatic. No speech. No warning. Just the decision made visible. He reached, aimed, and pulled. The room braced for sound that never came. The click was small, mechanical, final in its own way. In that instant, everything Anastasia needed surfaced. The failure stripped the act of its intended authority. Without the noise, there was no confusion. No one could pretend it was an accident or a misunderstanding. Intent stood alone, unsupported by outcome. Anastasia didn't flinch. That mattered more than anything else. A man who survives an attempt without reacting rewrites the balance of the room. Fear changes direction. Responsibility shifts. The shooter is no longer the aggressor. He is the exposed variable. The humiliation wasn't in the failure to kill. It was in the forced stillness that followed. Big Sam stood there with an empty outcome and a full audience. Every man present now knew what he had chosen and who he had chosen against. That knowledge couldn't be retracted. Anastasia waited. He didn't speak. He didn't order anyone restrained. He allowed the weight of the moment to settle. Men began to look away, not out of respect for Sam, but to distance themselves from him. Association drains faster than blood in rooms like this. By not retaliating immediately, Anastasia turned the act into evidence. Anyone who had encouraged Sam, anyone who had promised protection, anyone who had counted on chaos to cover their involvement now had to sit with the exposure. Silence became incriminating. Movement became suspicious. This was the strategy. Let betrayal announce itself. Let the room remember it collectively. Violence could come later, calibrated and quiet, without witnesses. What mattered now was that no one would ever confuse Sam's position again. The gun didn't fire because it didn't need to. It had already done its work. It showed who believed Anastasia could be removed, and it showed who had been wrong. The second after the click, who moves and who stays still. When the shot didn't come, the room revealed its real hierarchy. The ones who hid, the ones who looked down, the ones who instinctively found a door, and the ones who stayed still because they understood movement was confession. In that single second, Anastasia measured everyone without saying a word. Panic never spreads evenly. It fractures. One man stiffens. Another shifts his feet without realizing it. A third reaches for his coat, then stops halfway, trapped by the awareness that even that instinct has meaning. In the Linux room, the absence of sound forced those instincts into the open. The first movement came from the edges. Men who had positioned themselves as observers leaned back, creating space, trying to become furniture. They hadn't planned anything, but they also hadn't planned to intervene. Their instinct was distance. Anastasia noted it. Distance is not guilt, but it is not loyalty either. Closer to the table, two men looked down immediately. Not at the gun, not at Sam, at the floor. That was a different admission. Men who look down are thinking ahead, calculating how much they know and how little they want to be known for knowing it. That reaction suggested conversations that had happened elsewhere in safer rooms with softer language. Near the door, a chair scraped, just slightly. enough to test whether escape was possible, enough to be noticed. Anastasia didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. Men who look for exits at moments like this are not planners. They are contingency, useful in motion, unreliable under pressure. At the center of it all, Big Sam stood frozen. His stillness wasn't discipline. It was shock. The click had stripped his plan of momentum, and with it his authority. He had expected noise to cover him, confusion to follow. Instead, the room had gone sharp, focused, unforgiving. Anastasia stayed seated. That decision mattered. Standing would have escalated the moment. Shouting would have diluted it. By remaining still, he forced everyone else to confront their own movement or lack of it as a statement. Power wasn't asserted. It was observed. The men who impressed him most didn't move at all. Older Harlem operators. Men who had survived cycles of violence and understood its rhythm. Their hands stayed visible, their posture neutral. They knew the rule. In moments like this, innocence is demonstrated by restraint, not by explanation. Seconds passed, long enough for everyone to feel exposed, long enough for the hierarchy to redraw itself without a word being spoken. By the time Anastasia finally shifted in his chair, the room already knew what he knew. Who panicked, who calculated, who waited. That second after the click did more than identify a traitor. It mapped the room. And once Anastasia had that map, the outcome stopped being a question of if, only when. The night Harlem learned what untouchable means in a low voice, the impact wasn't measured in bodies that night. It was measured in the silences the next morning, in who stopped calling, in who started paying on time, in who stopped speaking about it like it was a rumor. Because when a man turns an assassination attempt into a public lesson, territory doesn't change through bullets. It changes through calculation. By sunrise, Harlem had already adjusted. Not publicly, not dramatically. Adjustments like this never announce themselves. They show up in absences. A runner who doesn't knock where he used to. A middleman who sends money early without being asked. A meeting that gets postponed and never rescheduled. Men didn't argue about what had happened. They accepted it. The story traveled carefully. No embellishments, no added heroics. Just enough detail to make the lesson unmistakable. Anastasia had been tested. The test had failed, and the response had not been rage. That was the part that unsettled people most. Violence could be answered. Retaliation could be anticipated. Patience could not. Those closest to Big Sam felt it immediately. Their phones rang less. Invitations dried up, not because orders had gone out, but because association had become dangerous. In Harlem, proximity to a mistake is its own liability. Men who had spoken too freely the week before now chose their words like they were inventorying risk. Payments tightened. Accounts balanced. Arguments over percentages disappeared overnight. Pride recalibrated itself into caution. Nobody claimed credit for keeping things quiet. Quiet was the point. Quiet meant the damage had already been assessed and contained. What Harlem learned was not that Anastasia was violent. That had never been in doubt. What it learned was that he didn't need violence to settle a challenge. He could let a moment breathe long enough for everyone involved to feel exposed, then leave without resolving it publicly. That kind of restraint changes how men plan. Untouchable stopped meaning unreachable. It came to mean something more precise. a man you cannot rush, a man whose reactions arrive after you've already committed yourself, a man who survives an attempt and makes the aftermath more expensive than the attempt itself. Bumpy Johnson understood the shift immediately. He didn't comment on it. He didn't posture. He let the neighborhood absorb the reality that something had changed without needing to be announced. Harlem still belonged to Harlem, but the margin for error had narrowed. Anastasia didn't return the next night. He didn't need to. His absence was now louder than his presence had been. Men filled that silence with their own conclusions, and those conclusions did the work that enforcement usually does. The night ended without blood, but it did not end unresolved. It ended with a recalculation. And Harlem, which had always known how to read power, learned that some men don't raise their voices when they become untouchable. They lower them and wait.